This episode, we're cranking the distortion and diving headfirst into the noise that defined the 90s misfit. Grunge wasn't just a music scene from Seattle, it was a whole mood. Muddy guitars, thrift store flannel shirts, ripped jeans, and a generation that side-eyed the shiny excesses and hairspray of the 80s and said, no thanks. This is Start Here, a podcast from the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music with me, Alexis Ffrench, that's all about getting under the skin of a genre. I'm a classical pianist, composer and producer, and I can talk endlessly about that world, but what about the world of dubstep, disco, heavy metal? Well, I'm excited to get into all of these genres on this series of Start Here. In this episode, we're talking the bands, the riffs, the heartbreak, and the beautiful mess that is grunge, from dive bar origins to accidental global takeover. So plug in, tune down, and get ready to relive the moment rock got raw, weird, and brutally honest. My guest today is radio presenter, journalist, and writer, Kate Hutchinson. Now, Kate, you've written about almost every music genre in your career so far, from the likes of The Guardian, The Observer, and The New York Times. What is it about grunge that makes it so unique? And can you give us your best elevator pitch as to why we should get into it?
I hope you like your riffs loud and raw and heavy, Alexis.
I do.
This is messy, unapologetic and deeply heavy music that came straight out of Seattle in the late 80s, early 90s, where the misfits punctured the mainstream and changed the chemical structure of rock music forever after. I love how it defined a generation of discontent, that Generation X energy. I love that it introduced me and the world to a whole load of incredible women in rock and amazing musicians. And I think it's so great also that it's become a genre that's so deeply embedded in our psyche in terms of an adjective. You know, we use grungy like we use jazzy or we use punky. I feel like grunge is so distinct and evocative in that way.
Absolutely. And music of the misfits as well. I absolutely love that. Where does the word grunge actually come from? It's quite a strange word. Did it exist before this music? And where did that come from?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I mean, I'm pretty sure that word it existed long before it was used to describe this new sound that was coming out of the Pacific Northwest. But what was really interesting, I think, is that at the beginning, much like most scenes when they're sort of in their formative years and they're kind of just starting, it didn't really have a name. It was just referred to as the Seattle sound. There were loads and loads of bands that were coalescing. They'd kind of come out of this sort of punk history that Seattle had. There were a lot of punk bands. They were getting heavier and heavier and sort of sludgier, if you like. And slowly this kind of new sound was kind of coming together. And it wasn't until a then young, quite plucky music journalist called Everett True, who was based in London. He was working for a magazine called Melody Maker. He booked a flight to Seattle because he'd heard something was going on. And he wrote this sort of scene piece about all the lead bands and the label that was at Grunge's centre in Seattle, Sub Pop. And he was the one that famously gave it the name grunge, and that's stuck ever since.
I see. So, and what makes the sound so unique? You describe this coming together of sludgy bands. I love that idea. But what makes it so unique in terms of its foundational DNA? What's in the sound itself? What's in the makeup, in the harmony, the melody? Or is it more about rebellion, something else entirely?
I think that there are some kind of key central tenets of grunge. All of those things feed into this sort of melting pot of this genre. Yeah. So the first thing is the context of what was going on in music at that time. So in the late 80s, you've got to imagine that the massive sort of big genre of the moment that all the bands wanted to be part of was this kind of hair metal, kind of big bouffanty lingerie rock movement that we associate with the sort of Sunset Strip in LA, right? So all of these metal bands, mostly men, had the big hairsprayed hair. They were covered in tight leathers, and they had these videos of scantily clad women. So there was a sense with grunge of really being reactionary to that and wanting to get back to the sort of simplicity of heaviness of heavy metal, so stripping it right back to that kind of heavy, sludgy riffage. So that's the sort of the first bit, was that grunge was a sort of a big sort of finger up, if you like, to that hair metal scene that they thought was totally uncool. Another element of grunge that's really important to mention is the lyrical content. So a lot of the song's themes reflected the alienation, the apathy, and the aforementioned angst of Generation X. I think the sound's most well-known song, Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana, really summed that up when Kurt Cobain sang, "Here we are now, entertain us." Like, go on then. Actually, the lore behind that song is pretty great, actually. I mean, Smells Like Teen Spirit is the sort of definitive grunge song, if you like. It is the sound of teenage rebellion bottled in a 3-minute short, sharp shock of aggression. But there's two parts of this song that I thought you might find interesting. One is that the intro, this really famous drum intro that the drummer Dave Grohl plays, he actually nicked that from some old disco records, like the Gap Band or Chic.
So I heard, yes. Yeah. Fascinating.
So, I love that one of the most iconic grunge songs, basically, the sound of grunge is directly linked to Black American funk and disco. I think that's really fascinating.
So do I. I think, I'm not sure, but I only read that recently. I'm not sure if that has been in the ether for a long time, but I love the fact that he openly shared that. And do you know what? I must tell you something, Kate. So yesterday I was listening to your fabulous podcast, The Last Bohemians, and also watching all the brilliant links that you'd sent through of grunge acts and listening to the music. And I went to YouTube and put on Nirvana because I just wanted to immerse myself in that space. And what I was watching, particularly with Nirvana, was this kind of stripped away musicality, devoid of that kind of musical rigor in any way, but replaced by extreme, vulnerable emotion. And is that a common theme? I think you have alluded to that. Is that a common theme through grunge? And is that one of the pivotal factors that separates it from the rock of, say, a Black Sabbath or something like this?
Yeah, I think that vulnerability and that sort of raw emotion is really key. Like you said, there weren't these sort of big, flowery, solos going on. There wasn't any sort of, big sort of, pompous drum fills. And they were really kind of getting away from that kind of glamour of that hair metal sound. So much like punk, it was really sort of delving into sort of realities of life. But grunge was sort of known for also looking inward. It was introspective. They were dealing with themes in the music that, had been touched on before, but not in this kind of movement-wide way of addiction, abuse, mental health problems. There wasn't really a kind of conversation in music at that time. A lot of artists were talking about misogyny in their lyrics. So I think that was one of the sort of key sort of thematic things that set them apart. And also, like you said, just kind of stripping everything back. This kind of sense of anybody could, start a band and create something really heavy that really sort of, underlined the kind of suburban sort of discontent, this kind of small town anger, this kind of, that a lot of these artists were coming from, really sort of small kind of logger towns, if you like, in the Pacific Northwest, not a lot going on. And just this kind of, this boredom, if you like, that they wanted something different. They wanted their lives to be something different. So there was a real sense of kind of pushing against that. And also, I think there was a real sort of kind of group sense of being anti-establishment and kind of anti-consumerism, anti-corporate. That these were artists that were coming from a punk scene. There was a whole kind of interconnected indie label network of labels that were putting out music, of fanzines and fanzine culture. I think, they were really representative of the fact that either you were alternative, or you turn the other way in the record shop and there was the top 40. This is at the beginning of grunge. Obviously, the irony is that grunge became the top 40 and it changed the sound of music and it became commercial. But this is in the beginning.
Yeah. Is there a particular instrumentation that one might find in a grunge act? So in those early days in Seattle, a typical grunge act stepping up into a slippery stage in a small club, what could we expect to see on that stage in terms of instrumentation?
Oh, in terms of instrumentation, because I was going to tell you in terms of look.
Let's have the look as well.
Look. So by the time grunge, which started, it was really popping off kind of 1988, 1989. By 1994 had kind of reached its apex, where the grunge look was being sold in shopping malls in America, and had fashion spreads in Vanity Fair with people like Joan Rivers dressed in the grunge chic. I think that when we think about grunge, we think about a particular style, which was that these artists were largely coming out of a very cold weather environment. There was a lot of plaid, there was a lot of lumberjack kind of overcoats and shirts. There were long johns. Amazing to think that long johns might be sold in Walmart as part of this
long
sort
johns.
Of
wow.
look. But here we are.
Okay.
And there was often sort of white sneakers, sort of trainer socks pulled up. What do you call those? The long white socks, the tennis socks, aren't they? I think they're tennis socks.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think I have a couple myself, actually. But moving on, yes.
Good to know. The baggy sort of denim, sort of board shorts, sort of surfer look that Pearl Jam were known for wearing, and then there was also the more kind of the thinking man's grunge, if you like, of the cardigan that Kurt Cobain was very famous for wearing. And then if you were a woman in rock, a woman in grunge, you might be wearing that, or you might be wearing essentially baby doll dresses, maybe smeared red lipstick. Courtney Love was very well known for wearing this look, and Kat Bjelland from Bays and Toyland, and messy hair, and probably some DMs. So that was the sort of look of grunge.
Okay.
It was definitely not.
It's quite studied, but yes.
that was what became synonymous with grunge. In terms of instrumentation, we are talking about meat and potatoes, bass, guitar, drums. Probably two guitarists. We're not talking about kind of two drummers like in metal. We're not talking about a synthesizer on stage. It was very much minimal. That kind of punk rock minimalism, for sure. And to see how much distortion you could get out of your instruments before you blew the amp. It was really about being the loudest and the sludgiest. And I found this amazing phrase about grunge. We were talking about the word grunge, where did it come from? Actually, the best phrase I found to describe what grunge sounds like is someone referred to it as the throbbing continuum of dirge. I've actually written it down here.
Wow, that's not something you'll find in a music encyclopedia at all. Certainly not the word throbbing, but very apt. The other thing which struck me, and just referring to the list of acts that you sent through, and I've been listening to Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, but we'll come on to these later. There was an act that I was reading about that preceded Nirvana, and from whom Nirvana derived much of their sound, particularly in terms of that pianissimo to fortissimo kind of feel of, that very hushed to really loud moment.
The dynamics.
Yes, indeed. And I wanted to talk to you about that, to ask you a question, whether Pixies, am I right in saying that they're a band who are renowned for, am I correct in that, Kate, or have I got that wrong? In that sort of, that surging dynamic from very, very hushed to very, very loud. But listening to some of the bands that I have doing, particularly some of the precursors to Nirvana and also Nirvana itself, particularly in that performance of Smells Like Teen Spirit, one would normally expect a dense texture of instrumentation in a song. But the other thing that struck me is just how sparsely textured the instrumentation actually was. I think with a bass, a guitar, the guitarist, obviously Kurt Cobain's, or the singer as well, and the drums, there was so much that went unsaid in musical terms. And as I guess as a classical musician, for me, that's quite. Obviously, I've heard this music before, but it's quite radical in a way. And again, not to labour the point about subito dynamics going from pianissimo to fortissimo, but the way that happened to me was quite Beethovenian, in the way that you might have that in a Beethoven sonata when you have this very almost like pugilistic textures preceded by very hushed moments. It's something that Beethoven is known for, particularly in his late piano sonatas, and to hear this in grunge music, but with this very radical instrumentation, devoid of almost all the sort of harmonic DNA that one might expect to hear, was really very, very powerful. And to see him singing that way, I mean, I found it thrilling, actually, just completely thrilling, listening to the music but for totally different reasons than I normally would hold on to when listening to, other types of music.
I love that. I feel like I'm learning more about grunge from doing this podcast, which is great. I love those details that you've picked up on. And actually, when you've got music, when you've got a sound, I guess a sort of baseline distortion and power like that, if you had that the whole way through the song, I don't think that it would land as powerfully as if you did have those, you need that contrast, you need the sort of quiet bits. But I also think there's, well, certainly in the case of Hole and Courtney Love, there's a knowing in those quiet bits. It's almost like toying with you. It's almost like playing with you. Like that she's dangling something, and you're waiting for the treat to drop where you can just go rah in the mosh pit.
Yeah. Now, Nirvana's Nevermind is, I think I'm right in saying, often credited with blowing grunge wide open in a commercial sense in 1991. But, who came before and who were really creating that sound for the first time? Take me back to school here, please.
So if we're really gonna nerd out here,
please,
there's actually a compilation that people can look up from 1986, the year I was born, and it's called Deep Six, and it's a formative compilation that features a lot of the bands that would go on to be associated with grunge. So this was really the kind of right at the beginning. There was a band called Green River. There was a band called the Melvins, who are 100%, you can hear the direct line from the Melvins kind of, celebration of sludge to Nirvana. Soundgarden were also on this compilation, and a band called bands called Malfunction, Skinyard, and Human. So bands that have kind of been lost a bit to time, but were still kind of very important. And the producer of that compilation, Jack Endino, he went on to produce a lot of the bands from that scene, including Mudhoney and really early Nirvana. He was the guy that slipped the Nirvana demo to Sub Pop, the Sub Pop label. And so I think people like him, were probably quite instrumental in sort of bringing a bit of cohesion. So I would say, if you really want to kind of get stuck into, what was the foundation of grunge, try and dig out that Deep Six compilation. I don't know if you can I don't think it's been reissued. You're probably going to have to go on Discogs or eBay to try and find that. But that's definitely known as the sort of first concrete example of where this sound was coalescing and kind of carving out an identity.
Jack Endino. So was he responsible for then the commercialization? So you mentioned that he slipped a demo tape to Sub Pop. What happened at that point in terms of when it really became big, when everyone started to pay attention to this, people started listening to it, and it started to dictate fashion sense and the way people made music? What happened then to the genre itself?
So I really don't think that we can overstate enough how completely kind of world-shaping and, transformational Nevermind was. The 1991 was a massive year for grunge. I mean, some of the really kind of key albums came out, including Eight-Way Santa by Tad, Mudhoney's Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, Pearl Jam's 10, and Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger. But when Nevermind came out, it just changed everything. It suddenly turned the world towards Seattle in a way that just kind of had never been done before. And Jack Endino, the producer that I mentioned, he had recorded some really early Nirvana stuff and sort of given that to Sub Pop, the label that ended up signing Nirvana. They put out Bleach in 1989. That was their first full-length album. Nevermind in 1991 was its follow-up. But this was also an album that I think was a split or had been released on Geffen Records. This was a major label album, which is part of the reason why, it was able to explode in the way that it did. I mean, also this was the, era of MTV and MTV2. And That Smells Like Teen Spirit video was incredibly powerful. To see just kids letting rip and moshing, it was a really kind of, instant way of saying, hey, this is what Nirvana's all about. And also, one of the reasons, the key reasons that album and that single really popped off in the way that it did is just because they were so good. And I think everybody at that time, when they heard, the original Nirvana demos, just knew that they were going to be huge. And also to see them live. I mean, before Kurt Cobain, was kind of struck down with many health issues and drug abuse issues, he was spinning on his head in their live shows. I mean,
seriously,
it's kind of amazing to see. Yeah, spinning on his actual head,
right,
playing upside down on his head. They had this incredible energy, which you can obviously hear in the music. So, in answer to your question, I think that, that was the moment that the world discovered grunge. And grunge became, Nirvana were the poster boys for grunge. They were on the cover of every magazine. They were on every TV station. They were overnight instant successes. They were enormous. They had more money than they had ever dreamed of. It was a success that it's hard to sort of really compare to now, because it just doesn't really happen the same way. But it blew up. Suddenly everybody was wearing checkered shirts,
What really happened when grunge hit the mainstream? What really happened to the music, to the audiences, to the artists? How did that change things?
Well, I mean, it really hit the mainstream in a huge way. In 1991, when Nevermind came out by Nirvana, grunge went supernova. Suddenly, everybody, all the major labels were racing to sign as many grunge bands as possible. Mainstream music and rock music, people were changing their sound to align more with grunge. Again, it became this really kind of dominating aesthetic and sound that was everywhere. And it really became massive very quickly. A lot of these artists signed to major labels and, maybe were dropped after one album, or, their careers just didn't happen in the way that they thought they would happen. There were missed opportunities. A lot of people found that very difficult to kind of acclimatize to the very sort of fast track, if you like, into that mainstream world and into that consumerist world that so many of the bands when they started were really sort of opposed to. And I think that's something that certainly, we've got a really famous example with Kurt Cobain and with Nirvana. He really struggled, I think, to acclimatize to that and to balance out the two things in his mind, the very kind of DIY, the very inclusive sort of vision that he had for his music, this anti-mainstream, anti-corporate, misfit music, with the fact that it became so massive. And
Indeed.
He essentially became a pop star. Now, when you bring into that the struggles that he had with heroin, with drug addiction, with his chronic pain, how he was medicating for that, and sort of just coping with those trappings of fame, also being one half of this incredibly famous and very scrutinized couple with Courtney Love from Hull. There was immense pressure on Kurt Cobain. And, like many grunge musicians of that period, an alarming amount didn't actually make it through. And so, I think it was probably, grunge was probably the first genre of that kind from the rock world, from that alternative world, that blew up in the way that it did and became a youth culture movement and something that you could also purchase if you wanted in a shop in America.
Yeah.
Or see in the pages of fashion magazines, and it was being sold back to people. And I think these artists that came from this punk scene, this tight-knit community in Seattle, of course, found that incredibly hard to cope with, and felt aghast at the fact that they were, quote unquote, be seen as selling out. That was a huge thing. You didn't want to be the ones that sold out. What happened when you did? What happened when you became successful? That was a really sort of central contrast and sort of push and pull at the heart of grunge, I think.
Yeah, it seems like there's a kind of irony to that as well, is in that there's an inherent dissonance in the fact that these artists are railing against the machine and, going against the man, as it were, and then this huge sort of commercial machinery has come in to exploit this music and turn it into this pop shiny thing. So it's huge sort of dissonance there, I'd imagine, not least for the people who were performing and singing this music. How important was the role of video? Obviously, you touched on MTV, and obviously we mourn its demise. Mm-hmm. But how important was video in Nirvana's story?
Oh, I think hugely, important in part of kind of, world building for any band, and sort of bringing their music to, reaching as many people as possible. I was, how old was I? 5 years old when this came out, something like that. So I came to Nirvana and grunge a lot later, but I didn't have MTV in my house, but my best friend did. And so she would make me compilation VHS tapes of all of the grunge videos and documentaries that she would find and see on the station. So, it was such an important way of, obviously keeping the legacy of those artists alive, but also of those bands alive, but seeing the style and seeing kind of regular people that looked like you. Again, it wasn't the sort of posturing and the kind of faux glamour of hair metal. And, it was, you were seeing people that could be your mates from school. And I think that was a huge part of also why it caught on, not just the music, but just the sense of kind of, this is for you. This is something that speaks to you. And your kind of suburban, boring place that you're living in and growing up in. I was a young woman figuring out feminism for herself. And what grunge really sort of signposted for me or highlighted or spotlighted for me was how powerful and strong and aggressive and gnarly and just as tough as the blokes women in rock could be.
That's really interesting.
So, and vulnerable and sensitive and raw and real and honest, all of the real complexities of womanhood I found through grunge bands like Hole, and then also a sort of parallel scene that was happening that also came out of a place called Olympia in Washington, so part of the Pacific Northwest, called Riot Grrrl. And Riot Grrrl is linked in with grunge. It started as a sort of, again, as a reaction to the sort of machoism, sort of male domination, and also a lot of the sort of, sexual violence that was going on at shows, where women didn't feel safe to be in the mosh pit or they're going to get their clothes torn off kind of thing. And that was going on at gigs. So Riot Grrrl really started as a reaction to that. And so, whether it was Courtney Love or Melissa Aufdemar or L7 or the band 7 Year Bitch or Darcy from Smashing Pumpkins or Bikini Kill and Kathleen Hanna, all of these women were so incredibly important in how I sort of navigated the world as a young woman.
I love that. Also, the way you describe the notion of accessing, I guess, adjacency to emotional range through this music, and in particular the women who were part of this movement, and that in a sense, if I've understood you correctly, allowing you to express more of your own emotional range and giving you almost permission to be, permission to outstretch your arms and embrace all of the rawness, all of the imperfection, all of the beauty, all of the physicality, and it's interesting. We're seeing that more now, of course, and we see women engage with very close contact sports and all sort of stuff that's happening quite rightly. But back then, am I right in thinking that was not the case, and there was a certain newness to seeing women in these spaces singing about the things that they were singing about in a really free way.
Well, definitely, but they were barely singing; they were more screaming, and I found that really powerful. That women and the men, but just specifically the women for a moment, were using rock music and grunge as the mouthpiece as the sort of megaphone for misogyny, for postpartum depression, for abuse, for violence, for the things that they had experienced or their friends had experienced. And I hadn't really heard, as a teenager, I really hadn't heard that in music in that way, as powerfully and sort of in the numbers that were present. Like that at all. And I suppose there was also with that a sort of sense of ownership over their bodies that I found really powerful as well. You could wear a dress that was short, and you could also rock out just as hard as any bloke, and you could still be taken seriously. That was the sort of interesting kind of tightrope that I found really confrontational and really alluring. You didn't have to take any, nonsense from anybody, and you could be fearless in what you wanted to say. And I think that's something that I still wish I had more of to this day. I think it still inspires me.
So what would we be talking about now in terms of the equivalent of who do you, for instance, feel closest to, and from a musical point of view, who's evoking the spirit of grunge now?
Well, I think there are a lot of artists coming out who are really inspired by grunge, and that's the sort of beauty of something like TikTok, in that it allows this, again, it's the portal that allows people the easy access to all of these amazing genres that are part of the great stew of sort of rock music. So, much like shoegaze, we're seeing a huge kind of wave of new artists coming through all the time who are super inspired by grunge. And I think also what's happening now, which is also really interesting, is that the kind of aesthetic is perhaps more prevalent and more sort of copied and or more called back to, if you like, than necessarily the principles. However, in saying that, personally, I think we're seeing the beginning of a quite interesting movement away from the corporatization of music. But that's, you know, the sort of the anti-Spotify movement, if you like, or the movement that's turning away from streaming services that underpay artists and that have changed the way that the music industry structure exists. The same kind of movement or the same mentality of people is, again, turning its back on maybe the profiteering of big ticketing companies, or that's not willing to pay that kind of money to go and see massive artists. So they're putting more time and effort and investment on a personal level into grassroots venues, into supporting local acts. I'm seeing in a sort of wider kind of context that happening and starting. I don't know if what you think, but starting to happen.
It's more and more difficult for live venues to survive these days. And we hear more and more of them struggling and closing in the same way that many pubs are closing. And of course, these are places where one could expect to see new emerging artists and bands growing up and coming through the scene. Where would one go? You know, if you're talking to your 15-year-old self, go here. This is where you're likely to find this person who's expressing all the things that you're yearning to say. Where do they exist now? Where do I go, for instance? Not that I'd be particularly welcome, but where would I go if I wanted to hear the next big thing, to find the next big sort of grungy act, as it were?
Well, just firstly, on what you said about music venues, I think we have to be really careful about how we talk about venues closing, because I think that it can often distract, not that this is what you're doing, but on the amazing venues that are still there and still going.
Of course. And
do still put on amazing talent. I mean, I was at the George Tavern in East London last night watching some amazing new bands. So those places are still very much there. And the thing that I think is disappointing about music venues closing is that we're losing the training ground. So the grunge bands of the late 80s did not, I mean, some of them got signed, after one gig, got given a major label contract, and then we never heard from them again after their first album tanked. That's such as a story. But these bands were really slugging it out in venues all over Seattle and the Pacific Northwest. They were really kind of getting good via playing live. So that for me is the really depressing thing about music venues closing, is that you lose the opportunity for people to be able to practice, basically, and get good and kind of find themselves as artists. Now, a lot of people are doing that digitally anyway. I think if you want to find some really new, exciting, emerging grunge bands, then Bandcamp is a really great place to start, not least because they do actually, much like a kind of old school record shop, split things into genres. So
nice.
You can very easily go and find grunge on there. You can see what the new releases are. It is your one-stop shop, instant portal for finding new music, and also the artists get paid at a really decent rate. So, if you go and buy something on Bandcamp Friday, I think they get an even better rate. So, that's really a great place to start. I would also say going to a record shop, like they would have done in 1991, and speaking to the person behind the counter and asking them what is a great new grunge band, because I can 100% guarantee you that there's some great new grunge coming out of America. Again, I think there's this kind of tangible shift that we're seeing towards kind of IRL real tangible things in our hands, maybe taking more time to listen to music, to listen to a record, to appreciate the listening experience. And that's just one aspect of this kind of mood shift, this kind of gear shift that's very slowly, creeping in across all culture that I can definitely feel. And grunge wasn't the sort of, the ground zero for that. It wasn't the sort of catalyst, but it was certainly part of a sort of mentality, I think. So yeah, I would definitely say go on Bandcamp and check out the grunge tab and see what's on there, because I can absolutely 100% guarantee there'll be some great new stuff, or at least some grunge adjacent stuff.
Now, it'd be remiss of me not to pick your brains about, shall we say, foundational grunge acts that listeners might be able to start somewhere where they might be able to start their listening journey in this particular genre. If you were to pick out 2 or 3, perhaps, who would you mention?
Okay, I feel like we've got Nirvana covered, so I'm going to move on from Nirvana.
Yes.
I'm going to pull those white socks up, and I think I have to mention Pearl Jam here as another band that you should definitely check out. Their kind of big album, Cornerstone album 10, came out in 1991, so definitely crank that one up loud on the car stereo.
Okay.
I think also, just to fast forward to 1994, and Hole's second album, Live Through This, came out just before Kurt Cobain died by suicide. So he died by suicide, I think, less than a week before this came out. And Hole were a band with Courtney Love singing, who just really kind of encapsulated this kind of angst and aggression, all of those things we were talking about with women. I mean, Love was such a formidable frontwoman, had a screech like you've never heard. I mean, it was really kind of nails down the chalkboard, whiskey soaked, kind of raw punk energy. I thought she was absolutely incredible. And this album really kind of underlines, if you like, what happens when fame can poison everything, when grunge was really at its biggest moment, when everything gets enormous beyond everyone's wildest dreams, and it kind of really zooms in on the relationship that was really at the kind of the center of grunge, and looking at sort of love's anguish about it all, and her kind of wrestling with her own body image and her own place in the world. So I definitely think Hole, who Melissa Alftamar, who I mentioned before, she joined on bass just after this. Kristen Pfaff, their original bassist, died of a heroin overdose 2 months, I think, after Kurt Cobain passed away. So there's a lot of death and destruction that has kind of weighed the grunge scene down, that it would be remiss not to kind of mention that there was a lot of addiction and abuse kind of rife within the Seattle scene, and a lot of the very talented, brilliant musicians, sadly fell prey to that, and could no longer battle their demons. So definitely important to mention Hole. And then the third starting, this is impossible, I'm going to say the Mudhoney track, Touch Me, I'm Sick.
Wow. Touch Me, I'm Sick. So I've got 4 bands there, Kate. I'm being the greedy one. I've been really well served. So I've got Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Hole, Mudhoney.
Oh, I wanted a bonus. Okay, so Mudhoney are my bonus one, and that
are they the bonus?
Touch Me, I'm Sick.
I'm grateful for the bonus, fun. Kate. Just to make it clear, I'm really grateful for the bonus, and I've written them all down. I'm really keen to. I think I've heard all of those to varying degrees. I have never heard, or to my knowledge, I don't think I've ever heard Mudhoney though. So I'm excited to listen to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
For a treat.
Am I? Yeah. Awesome. Listen, I feel This kind of needs a part B and a part C. There's so much that I want to ask you about. The wealth of knowledge that you have, your insights, perspectives, just really, really fascinating. Kate, thank you so much for joining me today on Start Here. Kate Hutchinson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Start Here, which is brought to you by the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music. If you liked today's episode, why not go back and check out the other 2 series of Start Here. If you like grunge, you might enjoy our episodes on hip-hop or K-pop for something completely different. Follow ABRSM on TikTok and Instagram and tell us what genre of music you want to be unpacked next.